everyone, and welcome to the Neuroscience of Mental Health. Today is Lesson 8, Addiction, Anxiety, and Depression. We've learned a little bit about the brain and about the neurochemicals, and now I want to talk to you about addiction, anxiety, and depression and how that can happen in terms of the brain. We'll first start talking about addiction. I showed you this visual talking about that the grasshopper, that limbic system, is where we get those neurochemical messages, the messages that tell our brain that something feels good, that we're a good person. It's where we feel our our emotions. And addiction kind of stems from one of those key neurochemicals of dopamine. The dopamine, as I said, is a message that can come to your brain in small little bursts, immediate, or it can go longer term. Um, and really, addiction kind of happens sometimes from where you get your dopamine. Are you getting it from those short bursts, and does that prime your brain for wanting those short bursts of dopamine? Or are you willing to work and recognize that hard work, can you get your dopamine from things that are healthy for you? The quick fix is kind of that addictive nature, whether you're doing video games, whether you're doing gambling, whether you're doing drugs, alcohol, that is kind of that. It gives you that dopamine rush. So can you get that dopamine in different ways? Because your brain is driven towards it. One of the things I talk about a lot in terms of talking to teens especially is when we think about addictive behavior, one of the things that really matters brain-wise is how early you start, how often you're doing it, and how potent it is. So whether you're talking about marijuana, whether you're talking about drinking, whether you're talking about whatever it is, if you start earlier, your brain has more time and begins to get primed for that reward. How often you're doing it. If you are, if you start drinking when you're 10 versus when you're 20, it makes a big difference in terms of particularly the adolescent brain. How often you're doing it. Do you drink once at a party, or are you going home and drinking every night? And then how potent. There's a big difference between having a beer and having shots of Jack Daniels. The potency makes a difference in terms of your brain's um, predisposition for that to become an addictive behavior. So it's important to recognize that. Another thing that I'll tell you is that I talk a lot sometimes about adolescence and marijuana. Marijuana actually affects the brain in two ways. One, it affects the pruning because endocannabinoids are the neurochemical that helps decide which of our neurons gets pruned, and cannabis can pretend to be an endocannabinoid. So it might prune away neurons that you might want to use later. The other thing it does is it attacks the myelin sheath, so it attacks the pavement. So it's very different when you're doing these things after adolescence, after your brain is pruned and paved. So that's one of the differences in terms of how early, how often, how potent is the degree to which these things are affecting your brain development. Anxiety and depression are also affected by those neurochemicals. But one of the things that I like to say is that violence, anxiety, and depression roughly translate to fight, flight, or freeze. It's the brain saying, that fight is violence and flight and freeze are kind of like anxiety and depression. And a lot of people think the opposite of anxiety is feeling calm and the opposite of depression is happiness. But I like to say the opposite of both of them is action, is knowing what to do, is having a way to respond, because our brain naturally goes fight, flight, or freeze. But if we have an action, if we know how to handle the challenge, our dragonfly can say, hey, we got this. We don't have to become depressed or become anxious because we're confident. We know we can handle that situation. So the opposite of anxiety and depression, the antidote to them is action. When we feel anxious, when we feel depressed, we kind of don't want to do anything. We kind of want to curl up in a ball in our bed. But the antidote to that is to act, is to have a way to respond. I thought I had the dragonfly there. Um, and really, the way to respond is building up those four S's, building up yourself, your understanding of who you are and what you stand for, the situation. Can you put things in perspective and break them down into doable parts? Those are ways to have some action. Supports, do you know who you can go to for help? And strategies, what are some things that you can do? Right now we're in this crisis, but how are you going to handle it? What are the things that you can do? How can you act in a way to keep you from getting anxious or depressed about it? So for the reflection for this, I want you to think about some strategies that you can put in place to help foster your own mental health and prevent addiction, anxiety, and depression. We're all at home. We need to think about actions right now. We need to think about how can we make ourselves feel better, whether it's a new skill, whether it's you're doing things in school, whether it's cooking, whether it's doing something that will help you to prevent this anxiety, depression, and addiction from happening because you are substituting it with things that are healthy for your brain. Um, I look forward to the next time. I hope that you have a good couple of days. Thanks. Bye bye.